A single stone from a medieval cathedral holds a world of forgotten stories. We often picture these monuments as the work of slaves, driven by a single king's command. This is the powerful but misleading story we have inherited. It is a slave narrative that reduces a breathtaking human achievement to a simple tale of oppression. That narrative hides a far more intricate truth. By the end of this, you will be able to look at any ancient structure and see the complex society that built it, not just a single ruler's will. What really happened between the drawing of the plans and the laying of the final stone? Who were the people whose hands shaped eternity, and what did they gain from such a colossal effort? The answer is a web of money, skill, faith, and social ambition that challenges everything we think we know. How much of history is shaped by the stories we choose to simplify? This powerful story is so deeply ingrained it has become our default setting. We hear the word pyramid and we see a whip. We picture a castle and we imagine a chain gang. This is the monolithic slave narrative, a lens that flattens centuries of human endeavor into a single, stark image of oppression. It tells us that these wonders were built by nameless, faceless masses, people with no choice, no voice, and no stake in the outcome. Their motivation is reduced to fear, their reward. The entire sprawling project is credited to the singular vision and iron fist of one person at the top. This narrative is compelling because it feels morally clear. It gives us a simple villain and a simple victim. But history is rarely that simple. By applying this modern, binary idea of slavery onto the medieval world, we accidentally erase the intricate social machinery that actually made these projects possible. We miss the spectrum of human experience that existed between total freedom and total bondage. To be clear, coercion was a real and terrible part of many historical labor systems. Hardship was widespread, but to define the entire enterprise by its worst element is to misunderstand it completely. It is like describing a vast, complex ecosystem by focusing only on the storms that sometimes pass through it. You miss the daily rhythms, the symbiotic relationships, the reasons why so many different kinds of life gathered there in the first place. The slave narrative simplifies motivation, assuming everyone involved was driven by the same force. It erases agency, suggesting that skill, pride, and personal ambition played no role. And most of all, it obscures social organization, making us forget that these were not random crowds, but structured communities with roles, hierarchies, and internal economies. When we look at a cathedral and see only slaves, what breathtaking human stories are we failing to see? The reality was a vast and varied landscape of work. To understand the hands that built the monuments, we must first set aside our modern categories and see the medieval world on its own terms. Labor existed on a broad spectrum, a range of conditions and agreements that defined a person's life. On one end, there was the stark reality of chattel slavery, where individuals were treated as property. This practice, though diminishing in parts of Western Europe after the year 1000, never fully disappeared. More common was serfdom, a state of being unfree, bound to a lord's land and obligated to provide labor for a set number of days each year. Yet even here, the picture was not uniform. A serf might work their own plot of land for most of the week, and only on certain days be required to contribute to a communal project, like repairing a bridge or a lord's mill. Between these poles of unfreedom and the ideal of free wage labor existed a fascinating middle ground. There was indentured service, where a person would contract their labor for a fixed period, often years, in exchange for training, passage to a new land, or the settlement of a debt. There was customary service, obligations tied to tradition and local law, which could feel as fixed as serfdom but were rooted in community practice. And then there was compulsory service, a duty demanded by a king or lord from all subjects, free or not, for the defense or glory of the realm. This was the call to arms or the call to build a city wall. Now shift your gaze to the other side of the spectrum. Here we find the wage laborers, the true precursors to modern workers. These were often skilled individuals who moved from town to town, project to project, selling their labor for cash. And towering above them in social and economic prestige were the guild-based artisans. These were the master masons, the carpenters, the stone carvers, the glaziers. They were not laborers in the common sense. They were artists and engineers, organized into powerful fraternities that guarded their secrets, set prices, and trained apprentices over years of meticulous work. Finally, consider the profound motivation of voluntary religious service. Countless monks, nuns, and lay believers donated their time and skill as an act of devotion, a spiritual offering made with their own hands. The crucial insight is that a single project, like a great cathedral or a royal palace, drew from almost every point on this spectrum at once. The foundation trenches might be dug by serfs fulfilling their seasonal labor dues. The heavy stone might be hauled by compulsory service levies from the surrounding county. The intricate carpentry for the roof would be done by a guild carpenter, paid a handsome wage and housed in the town. The exquisite stained glass would be crafted by a master artist who answered to no lord, only to his guild and his patron. And the delicate carvings around the altar might be the patient work of a monk in the nearby abbey. This was not a monolithic workforce. It was a temporary society, a bustling, stratified community that appeared on a building site, where a lord's obligation, a craftsman's pride, a laborer's wage, and a believer's faith all worked side by side toward a common, towering goal. How did such a diverse group even function together? The answer lies not in a whip but in a ledger. That ledger comes to life in the story of one of the world's most famous buildings. Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris did not rise quickly. Its construction spanned more than a century, from the laying of its first foundation stone in the year 1163 to the completion of its iconic soaring spires nearly 200 years later. This was not a single project but a continuous campaign, a grand endeavor that survived shifting kings, changing architectural styles, and the passing of generations. The scale is almost impossible to grasp today. We are talking about a structure designed to hold thousands of people, built with stone quarried miles away, and decorated with countless sculptures, each one a masterpiece in itself. To simply call this a building project feels inadequate. It was the medieval equivalent of a multi-generational space program, a sustained investment of a society's wealth, faith, and skill. And to make it happen, the cathedral required not one workforce but many, each with its own relationship to the project and its own reasons for being there. At the very top were the patrons, the visionaries who provided the capital and the political will. This began with Bishop Maurice de Sully, who conceived the idea to replace the older cathedral on the site with something unprecedented. He dedicated a significant portion of the diocese's own revenues to the work. Later, King Louis IX, known as Saint Louis, became a major benefactor, donating vast sums and precious relics, tying the monarchy's prestige directly to the cathedral's glory. Their money was essential, but it was not direct commands that moved the stone. That money flowed downward, creating an economic ecosystem. It paid the salaries of the master mason, the architect in charge who designed the vaults and directed the work. It funded the workshop of the master carpenter, who engineered the complex timber frames for the roof. It purchased the glass from specialists in the city and the lead to hold it all together. This financial river fed an entire community of specialized, highly skilled, and highly paid free artisans. They were not subjects fulfilling a duty. They were contractors selling their expertise to the highest bidder, and a project like Notre Dame was the pinnacle of their career. But beneath these elite craftsmen was another layer of essential labor. The stone itself had to be extracted from quarries, loaded onto barges, floated down the Seine River, and then hauled through the streets of Paris to the building site. This backbreaking work was often done by a different class of worker. Some were local Parisians hired for daily wages, a crucial source of income for the city's growing population. Others might have been peasants from surrounding lands, fulfilling part of their annual labor obligations to their lord or to the church itself, a form of required service that provided the raw muscle for the project. And we cannot forget the role of voluntary, devotional labor. While the intricate carvings were likely the work of paid sculptors, the simple act of hauling a basket of rubble or providing food for the workers could be an act of piety for a devout citizen, a way to physically participate in raising a house for God. So on any given day in the 12th century, the site of Notre Dame was a microcosm of medieval society. A master mason from another region commanding a high salary would point to a drawing. A local wage laborer paid by the day would mix mortar. A peasant fulfilling his yearly service duty would haul a block from the riverbank, and a wealthy merchant's wife might donate funds for a specific stained glass window, ensuring her family's name was associated with the holy light. This was the complex engine behind the monument, a machine powered by faith, finance, obligation, and ambition. But what about the individuals who left no name in the ledgers? The soaring height of a cathedral spire was first a line in an account book. To understand the labor, we must follow the money, and that trail leads to a surprising array of patrons. While kings and queens capture our imagination, they were often just one part of a complex financial consortium that brought stone dreams to life. The primary engine for monumental building in medieval Europe was not the royal treasury, but the church. A bishopric, the administrative heart of a diocese, functioned like a major corporation. It owned vast tracts of land, collected tithes from the faithful, and managed its own courts and taxes. When a bishop like Maurice de Sully envisioned a new cathedral, he was tapping into this immense, sustained revenue stream. Funds flowed from agricultural rents, fees for sacraments, and the offerings of pilgrims. This institutional wealth provided the stable, long-term capital required for projects that spanned generations. Monasteries, too, were powerhouse patrons. As centers of learning, agriculture, and craft, they often financed their own elaborate abbey churches, employing a mix of skilled lay brothers and hired specialists from nearby towns. But the story does not end with religious institutions. As cities grew in wealth and political power, urban communes began to fund their own civic pride. A wealthy trading city like Florence or Bruges would collectively finance a stunning town hall or a massive cloth hall, symbols of their commercial independence from feudal lords. The funds came from municipal taxes, tariffs on goods, and direct contributions from the powerful merchant guilds who governed the city. This shift from religious to civic patronage had a direct impact on labor. A city council hiring a master mason was engaging in a business contract, negotiating for the best talent their money could buy, often drawing artists from far afield in a competitive market for skill. Then there were the individual patrons, the super wealthy of their day. A successful merchant, a powerful noble family, or a high-ranking church official might personally fund a specific chapel, a stained glass window, or an altarpiece within a larger church. This was philanthropy fused with personal branding. Their donation guaranteed their name, their family coat of arms, or their likeness would be forever associated with a piece of the sacred structure, a very public display of piety, wealth, and legacy. Even ordinary people participated through micro-donations. The sale of indulgences, which promised a reduction of time in purgatory, though later controversial, funded countless building campaigns. More directly, people might pay for a specific candle, a roof tile, or simply drop a coin in a collection box, becoming a small part of the grand financial mosaic. Each of these funding sources created a different relationship with the workforce. Church funds might pay both a wage to a master craftsman and fulfill a labor obligation from a serf on church lands. A city's tax revenue would exclusively hire free wage laborers and guildsmen. A wealthy merchant's direct commission would go straight into the pocket of a specific artist or workshop, fostering innovation and personal artistic expression. The patron did not just write a check, they set the project's very priorities. A bishop might insist on theological correctness in the sculptural program. A city council might demand a clock tower for civic timekeeping. A merchant patron might want a chapel that doubled as a lavish family tomb. This constant negotiation between the patron's vision, the architect's genius, and the practical limits of budget and material is what gives each monument its unique character. The money was never abstract. It was the vital fuel that attracted skill, organized muscle, and turned a collective dream into enduring stone. So if the patrons held the purse strings, who actually held the chisels and made the day-to-day decisions on the ground? That authority belonged to a figure we have almost forgotten, the medieval world's closest equivalent to a celebrity CEO. The master mason was the undisputed king of the building site. He was not a laborer, but a combination of architect, structural engineer, and chief executive officer, a man whose mind held the entire cathedral in perfect mathematical detail before a single stone was laid. His value was so immense that he commanded a salary and privileges that rivaled those of a minor noble. He was often provided with a fine house, a generous clothing allowance, and even a servant, all paid for by the cathedral's building fund. This was not a local craftsman, but a mobile international superstar. A master might be born in France, train in Germany, and then be lured to England or Italy by a wealthy patron offering a better contract, his reputation preceding him like a modern celebrity athlete. His knowledge was his fortune, guarded fiercely and passed down through a long apprenticeship system. He understood geometry, the properties of stone and timber, and the sacred principles of proportion that were believed to reflect divine harmony. His primary tool was not a trowel, but the tracing floor, a large, flat surface of plaster or stone where he would scratch out the full-scale, intricate diagrams for vault ribs, window tracery, and sculptural templates. These drawings were the blueprints from which all other craftsmen worked. On site, his authority was absolute. He coordinated the work of the various guilds, the carpenters, the glaziers, the smiths, ensuring their contributions fit together in a complex, three-dimensional puzzle. He solved engineering crises in real time, figuring out how to support a wall as an arch was being built, or how to safely raise a massive timber beam hundreds of feet into the air. This required a deep, practical intuition for physics, learned through experience and the shared knowledge of his fraternity. These master masons formed a kind of medieval intellectual elite. They could read Latin contracts, correspond with patrons, and move in powerful circles. Their signatures are not autographs, but the unique architectural styles and innovative solutions they pioneered, leaving a personal mark on the skyline of Europe. When you look at the dizzying height of a Gothic nave, you are seeing the audacious confidence of a master mason who convinced an entire city to trust his calculations. But his brilliant plans were useless without the hands of the guildsmen who turned abstract lines into solid reality. These master craftsmen did not work in isolation. They were the most prominent members of a powerful and exclusive system, the craft guild. If the master mason was the architect, the guild was the entire professional and social world that made his vision possible. For a medieval stonemason, carpenter, or glazier, the guild was everything. It was his trade union, his quality control board, his insurance provider, and his social club, all rolled into one. To practice a skilled trade in a city, you almost always had to be a member of its guild. This system created a protected class of labor, a world apart from the peasant tied to the land or the serf fulfilling an obligation. Guild membership meant you were not just a worker, you were a professional, and your skill had a recognized monetary value. The path to that status was long and strictly controlled. It began with apprenticeship. A boy, usually in his early teens, would be formally bound by a contract to a master craftsman for a term of years, often 7 or more. He lived in the master's household, receiving food, lodging, and training, but no wage. This was an investment of time and labor in exchange for knowledge. The apprentice learned the secrets of the trade from the ground up, from how to select the right grain of wood for a roof beam to the precise mix for durable mortar. The guild ensured the master provided proper training and that the apprentice fulfilled his duties, protecting the quality of future craftsmen. After his term, the apprentice became a journeyman, from the French word journée, meaning a day's work. Now he could earn a daily wage for his skill, but he was not yet a master. To earn that title, he had to produce a masterpiece, a piece of work judged worthy by the guild's masters, proving he had absorbed the full depth of the craft. Only then could he open his own workshop, take on his own apprentices, and vote in guild affairs. This system had a direct, profound impact on monumental building. First, it guaranteed a high standard of quality. A guild enforced strict rules on materials and methods. A carpenter's guild would specify the types of joinery allowed in a structural frame. A glazier's guild controlled the composition of glass and the techniques for painting and firing it. This meant that a patron hiring a guildsman knew exactly what they were getting, a level of reliability crucial for a project meant to last centuries. Second, the guilds controlled wages and working conditions. They negotiated as a collective, preventing masters from undercutting each other and ensuring their members were paid what their expertise was worth. The records show guild craftsmen on cathedral sites earning several times more than common laborers. They also enforced rules about hours, safety, and even provided support for members who fell ill or for the families of those who passed away, creating a crucial social safety net. This structure created a mobile professional class. A journeyman stonemason from Cologne, having learned the local style of carving foliage, could travel to Paris or Chartres, present his credentials to the local guild, and find work. He brought new ideas and techniques with him, which is how architectural styles spread across Europe, not by royal decree, but through the movement of skilled hands. On a major site like Notre Dame, you would find not one monolithic workforce, but a collection of different guilds, each with its own lodge, its own traditions, and its own pride. The stone carvers, creating the countless gargoyles and saints, were a different brotherhood from the carpenters building the vast timber skeleton of the roof. They worked in concert, but their loyalties and identities were tied to their craft. Their labor was not an anonymous contribution. It was a proud, professional achievement, their signature on history etched in stone and glass. Yet for all their skill and privilege, the guildsmen represented only one layer of the vast team, who moved the mountains of material that fed their talented hands. A cathedral began as a forest of stone blocks in the mason's yard. This was the domain of the stonecutters and layers, the on-site elite whose specialized hands transformed rough quarry rock into the precise geometry of a Gothic arch. Their workplace was not the soaring nave, but a covered workshop called the lodge, a bustling hive of focused activity protected from the weather. Here, the master mason's full-scale drawings from the tracing floor were translated into wooden templates. A stonecutter would place this template on a block and meticulously chip away everything that did not match the shape, creating a perfectly formed voussoir for an arch, a mullion for a window, or a delicate leaf for a capital. This was not brute force, it was a high-precision craft. Their tools were extensions of their skill, the point chisel for rough shaping, the claw chisel for finer detailing, and the all-important mallet, each strike a calculated removal of stone. The sound of a medieval building site was not the crack of a whip, but the rhythmic tap-tap-tap of 100 masons at work, a percussion of creation. These men were not interchangeable units of labor. The building accounts from places like Westminster Abbey or York Minster list them by name, distinguishing between the higher-paid master cutters and the layers who set the finished stones in place with mortar. Many were paid by the piece, receiving a set fee for each finished stone they produced, a direct incentive for both speed and quality. A beautifully carved capital with intricate foliage would earn more than a simple rectangular block. Others, especially those setting the stone, earned a solid daily wage, often with bonuses for working at dangerous heights. This was a meritocracy of skill, where talent directly translated into better pay and status. The most powerful proof of their individual identity lies not in ledgers but in the stones themselves. Look closely at the hidden surfaces of medieval buildings, on the backs of blocks or the inner faces of walls, and you will often find a mason's mark. This was a simple, unique symbol, a combination of lines and curves that a cutter would chisel into his finished piece, his personal signature in stone. It was a practical system for the master mason to track output and assign wages, ensuring each man was paid for the work he had done. But it was also a statement of pride and ownership. In a structure meant to last for eternity, a humble craftsman ensured that his contribution, however small, was permanently recorded. He was not an anonymous slave lost to history. He was a known professional, a man like Reginald the Mason or William the Layer, whose skill was valued, whose work was accounted for, and whose mark still whispers his presence across the centuries. These marks are the forgotten signatures on the contract of history, proving that the labor behind the monument was a collaboration of individuals, not a coerced mass. Yet for every finely carved stone, there were 100 that needed to be moved, and that required a different kind of strength altogether. The rhythmic tap of the chisel was accompanied by a deeper, more constant rumble. For every masterfully carved block in the mason's lodge, 100 more needed to be moved from the quarry yard to the rising walls. This was the world of sheer physical power, the domain of the carters, the diggers, and the bearers. Theirs was not the labor of precision, but of immense, coordinated effort, and they formed the largest single group on any major building site. To call their work unskilled, however, is a modern misreading. Hauling a multi-ton block of stone up a slippery, narrow ramp hundreds of feet in the air required a terrifying kind of expertise, a knowledge of balance, teamwork, and sheer nerve that no ledger could ever fully capture. This workforce was itself a patchwork, drawn from different strands of medieval society for different reasons. A significant portion came from the countryside, from the peasantry fulfilling their traditional labor obligations. This system, known as the Corvee, required a peasant to provide a set number of days of work each year for their lord, which could include maintaining roads, digging ditches, or, when a major project was underway, contributing muscle to a building campaign. For a peasant, this was not a career choice but a customary duty, a tax paid not in grain but in sweat. It was often seasonal, timed for the quieter periods of the agricultural calendar after the harvest was in. So the man straining on a rope to lift a stone in October might, in the spring, be plowing his own strip of land miles away. Alongside these obligatory workers were the casual wage laborers, drawn from the growing population of the towns themselves. Medieval cities were full of people living hand to mouth, day laborers who gathered at dawn in market squares hoping to be hired for any task. For them, a cathedral project was a godsend, a source of steady, paid work that could last for years. They were paid by the day or by the task, their names often listed in account rolls simply as John the Carter or William the Digger. Their motivation was starkly economic, the need to feed a family, and their relationship to the project was purely transactional. In some rare and difficult cases, authorities might also compel individuals who had committed minor offenses to contribute labor as a form of penalty, though this was far less common than popular stories suggest. The crucial point is that these groups of strong backs were not a permanent, enslaved underclass. They were a rotating, temporary force. A peasant fulfilled his yearly duty and returned home. A day laborer might work on the cathedral for a season, then move to a different project building a city wall or a wealthy merchant's house. Their work was compulsory for some, voluntary for others, but it was almost always finite. This stands in sharp contrast to the permanent, skilled core of the operation, the master masons and guildsmen whose identities were tied to the project for decades. The monument's foundation, therefore, was a deliberate blend of obligation and opportunity. The lord or bishop provided the compulsory muscle of his tenants, fulfilling a feudal right while advancing his grand vision. The project's steady stream of cash then attracted the urban poor, creating jobs and stimulating the local economy. It was a pragmatic fusion, using the old system of duty to supply the raw power, and the new system of cash to attract additional hands and reward the essential skilled artisans. On the ground, this meant a social hierarchy was visibly etched into the work itself. The master mason, in his fine robes, consulted his plans in the tracing house. The guildsmen, in their workshop lodges, focused on their precise crafts, and out in the open yard, a shifting crowd of men, some grumbling about their forced service, others grateful for the wage, heaved and pulled in a coordinated dance of brute force, their collective strength quite literally lifting the work of the artists into the sky. One system provided the stable, skilled intelligence, the other provided the temporary, powerful body. But how did this temporary, often reluctant army of labor actually organize such dangerous and complex tasks without modern machinery? The answer lies in a forgotten technology of wood and ingenuity. The peasant fulfilling his yearly labor duty was not a blank slate. He arrived at the site with his own world, his own knowledge, and his own set of obligations that stretched far beyond the cathedral walls. To understand his role, we must look more closely at the very system that brought him there, the world of serfdom and the corvée. The word serf often conjures an image of a person bound to the land, which is true, but the reality of that bond was a complex web of customary rights and duties that varied from village to village. A serf was not a slave in the chattel sense. He typically owned his own tools, worked his own family plot of land, and could pass possessions to his children. In exchange for the right to live on and work that land, he owed his lord a portion of his harvest and, crucially, a set number of days of labor each year. This compulsory labor was the corvée. It was a tax paid not with coin, but with the sweat of one's brow. Now, here is where the popular story about monument building often goes astray. It is easy to assume that a powerful lord or bishop would simply round up hundreds of his serfs and march them off to a distant city to work for years on a cathedral. But from a practical, medieval standpoint, that was often a terribly inefficient idea. Think about it from the lord's perspective. His wealth came from the agricultural output of his lands. If he removed a significant portion of the male labor force during planting or harvest season, his own manors would suffer and his income would plummet. Furthermore, transporting, feeding, and housing large groups of peasants in a city for months on end was a logistical and financial nightmare. The corvée was a local tool designed for local needs. It was the engine that maintained the lord's own immediate infrastructure. The typical corvée labor was spent repairing the local mill, clearing the manor's fish pond, digging drainage ditches in the fields, or maintaining the roads and bridges that connected the lord's estates. When a lord needed to fortify his own home, it was corvée labor that would dig the moat and raise the earthworks for a castle's outer walls. This was work that directly benefited the lord's defense and economic control right where he lived. So how did serfs end up on a grand project like a cathedral? The connection was often more indirect and contractual. When a bishop launched a cathedral project, he was drawing on the resources of the church, which was itself a major landowner. Serfs on church lands might have their corvée obligations redirected. Instead of digging a ditch on a remote farm, they might be assigned to haul stone from a nearby quarry owned by the church for a set period, perhaps a few weeks each year. This was still compulsory labor, but it was applied locally to a specific church-owned asset that fed the larger project. In other cases, a lord might commute the labor duty for cash. A peasant could pay a fee to be released from his corvée days, and that money would then be used by the lord or the church to hire willing wage laborers in the city who were already there and needed no housing or long-term support. This was often a better deal for everyone. The peasant stayed on his farm, the lord got flexible cash, and the project got a motivated worker who showed up for a wage. This reveals a crucial nuance. The unfree labor that contributed to monuments was often not the direct, hands-on carving of stone high on the scaffolding. It was more likely the indirect foundational work, the extraction and transport of raw materials, the digging of foundation trenches, or the production of the thousands of tiles needed for the roof. It was the heavy, seasonal, logistical work that created the river of material which fed the skilled artisans at the building site. The serf's relationship to the soaring spire was one of many steps removed. His compulsory effort helped mine the stone, but the act of turning that stone into a piece of heaven was almost always the paid, proud work of a free craftsman. This distinction matters because it changes the story from one of simple oppression to one of a complex economic engine. The monument did not just consume forced labor, it helped transform traditional obligations into cash, stimulated urban job markets, and created a pipeline where the old world of feudal duty indirectly fueled the new world of artistic ambition and wage-based skill. So if the serf's role was more often in the background, supplying the raw ingredients, who managed the breathtakingly complex recipe of putting it all together? A castle rising on a contested border tells a different story from a cathedral in a peaceful city. When the purpose shifts from glorifying God to securing a kingdom, the logic of labor shifts dramatically. Military construction, especially frontier fortifications and castles built in haste, represents the special case where coercion and compulsory service were not just present, they were often the primary engine. The need was urgent, the threat was immediate, and the priority was speed over artistry. In these scenarios, the call to labor was less an economic contract and more a direct extension of royal or lordly power for communal survival. Following a military conquest, it was a common practice for the victorious ruler to compel the local, recently subdued population to dismantle their own fortifications and then use that same labor to build new ones for the conqueror. This served a dual purpose. It created a stronghold to control the region, and it physically and psychologically exhausted the defeated community, reducing their capacity to rebel. The famous Domesday Book survey of England, commissioned by William the Conqueror, meticulously recorded not just land and wealth, but also the labor services owed by each district, a clear blueprint for marshalling manpower for royal castles like the Tower of London. For earthworks, the most brutal and essential first phase of castle building, this levied labor was crucial. Before a single stone was set, a massive mound of earth, the motte, had to be raised, and a deep ditch, the moat, had to be dug around it. This was work measured in thousands of cubic yards of soil, moved by hand with baskets and shovels. It was backbreaking, unskilled, and dangerous. To accomplish it quickly, a lord or sheriff would issue a summons, a compulsory levy, demanding that every village in his jurisdiction send a quota of men, often with their own tools and oxen, to work for a set period. This was the corvée system applied with military urgency. The peasant arriving at such a site was not learning a trade, he was fulfilling a defensive duty, a shared burden for the supposed safety of the realm, under the watchful eyes of the Lord's soldiers. The atmosphere was one of necessity, not devotion. Yet even here, the story is not one of simple slavery. Once the urgent earthworks were complete and the slower, skilled work of stone construction began, the labor pool often changed. Building a durable stone keep, with its complex vaults and defensive features like arrow loops and murder holes, required the same master masons and guild-trained craftsmen as a cathedral. These experts were not conscripted, they were hired. Their specialized knowledge of siege engineering and military architecture was a valuable commodity, and they commanded high wages from lords who needed their expertise to ensure the fortress would actually withstand an attack. So a castle site often saw two distinct phases: an initial burst of coerced mass labor for the raw earth moving, followed by a longer, more professional period of skilled, paid construction for the stonework. This stands in sharp contrast to the century-long cathedral project. A cathedral required stability, patience, and artistic continuity. It needed a core workforce of highly motivated, well-compensated experts who would dedicate their lives to the project, and a reliable economic system to support them for generations. You could not compel a master glassmaker through a yearly labor duty. His art was the result of a lifetime of voluntary training. The cathedral was a magnet for free talent, a collaborative artwork. The frontier castle, especially in its early stages, was often a project of imposed will, a demand for collective muscle. One was an act of creation that attracted a society's best. The other, in its foundational moments, was an act of control that commanded a population's strength. This distinction helps us see that the medieval world understood different tools for different tasks, using obligation for raw power and cash for refined skill. But if labor was so varied and structured, what was the ultimate glue that held such a fragmented workforce together across decades? The true magic of these projects was not just in the stone, but in the spirit of the people who touched it. Beyond ledgers and obligations, there existed a powerful, invisible force that animated the work, voluntary labor driven by faith and community. This is the dimension completely erased by the slave narrative, the idea that someone would willingly, even joyfully, give their sweat to a monument they might never see finished. For the medieval mind, contributing to a great church was not just a duty, it could be a direct pathway to spiritual grace. The church taught that good works, including physical labor, could help atone for one's missteps and bring the soul closer to heaven. This belief translated into tangible action. Chronicles from the building of Chartres Cathedral describe moving scenes where entire towns turned out in a kind of sacred procession. Nobles and merchants, farmers and housewives would form long lines stretching from the quarry to the building site, passing stones hand over hand along the route. They sang hymns as they worked, transforming back-breaking labor into an act of collective worship, a physical prayer made by the whole community. This was not about a wage or a lord's command, it was about participating in something larger than oneself. Individuals might also pledge donated days, offering their labor for free as a personal vow. A baker might promise to work one day a month hauling sand for mortar. A blacksmith might offer to sharpen tools on a holy day. These contributions, small on their own, created a vast reservoir of goodwill and shared ownership. The project became theirs, a common endeavor that bound the community together across social lines. Another powerful motivator was the system of indulgences. While later controversies would cloud its practice in the high medieval period, an indulgence was essentially a formal recognition from the church that a specific act of piety could reduce the temporal punishment for one's shortcomings. Contributing money or labor to a cathedral could earn such an indulgence. This was not a cynical transaction for many, but a structured opportunity to align one's daily life with spiritual aspirations. It offered a clear, tangible way for ordinary people to connect their physical effort to their eternal well-being. We see this same spirit in civic projects. When a growing town decided to build a magnificent cloth hall or a fortified gate, It was a statement of independence and collective pride. The wealthy merchants' guilds would fund it, but the townspeople themselves took pride in its progress. It was a symbol of their shared prosperity and security, and contributing to it, even in a small way, reinforced one's identity as a citizen. This voluntary layer of labor is crucial because it changes the emotional landscape of the building site. It means that amidst the paid craftsmen and the obligated peasants, there were also people who were there because they wanted to be. Their presence added an atmosphere of festival and devotion to the grind of construction. It turned the site from a mere workplace into a theater of faith and community ambition, where the very act of building was a ritual that strengthened the social fabric. If the master mason provided the mind and the guildsmen the hands, this voluntary spirit provided the heart. But how do we reconcile this image of pious community with the undeniable hardships and inequalities of the age? The story requires us to hold two truths at once. The hymns sung by volunteers were often accompanied by the clatter of serving bowls. To assume the monumental workforce was entirely male is to miss half the story. While the high-status roles of master mason or stone carver were almost exclusively held by men, the world that supported them, the essential ecosystem that kept a building site alive for decades, was profoundly shaped by women's labor. Their contributions were vital, documented in account books and civic records, yet they operated in the spaces between the grand narratives, their work considered ancillary but in reality foundational. The most visible role for women was in provisioning. A site with hundreds, sometimes thousands of workers required an immense amount of food and drink daily. Women ran the cookshops and brew houses that surrounded major projects. They baked the bread, brewed the ale which was a staple of the medieval diet, prepared stews in large cauldrons, and managed the distribution of meals. This was not casual work, it was a licensed taxable business. A woman known as a brewster or alewife could build a substantial livelihood supplying a cathedral project, her economic fate tied directly to its progress. Beyond selling, women were also central to the domestic economy that supported migrant workers. Master craftsmen who traveled from afar often brought their families. Their wives managed the household, cared for children, and sometimes took in lodgers or apprentices, creating a stable home life that enabled the craftsman's focused work. For the lower-paid laborers, women provided crucial boarding in their own homes, turning domestic space into an informal hostel. This network of lodging, food, and care was the invisible infrastructure without which the skilled workforce could not function. In the realm of crafts, women's work was often channeled into specific, highly valued trades. While they were typically barred from the stonemasons' or carpenters' guilds, they were active in others. The production of textiles was a domain where women excelled. The vast tapestries that warmed cold stone walls, the embroidered altar cloths, and the vestments for priests were frequently the work of women's hands in convent workshops or in urban craft households. In places like Paris, women are recorded as members of the silk-making and linen drapers' guilds. Their skilled labor literally clothed and adorned the interior world of the monument. There is also evidence, though more sparse, of women performing unskilled manual labor on sites. Widows or wives of laborers might step in to fulfill a family's labor obligation or to earn a crucial daily wage. They could be found hauling water, mixing mortar, carrying rubble in baskets, or thatching temporary shelters on the site. Their presence in the account rolls is often fleeting, listed simply by a first name or as the wife of, but their physical effort was part of the collective muscle that moved the project forward. To see only the men on the scaffolding is to misunderstand the medieval household as an economic unit. Labor was a family enterprise. A blacksmith's wife might manage the bellows and the sale of his goods. A mason's daughter might learn to read plans in the tracing house. The project did not just employ individuals, It sustained entire families and created economic niches that women filled with ingenuity and resilience. This complicates the labor picture beautifully. It moves us from a vision of a solitary, male genius directing a mass of male drones to a holistic view of a temporary town. This town had not only architects and artisans, but also innkeepers, brewers, merchants, nurses, and teachers, many of whom were women. Their work provided the continuity, the daily sustenance, and the social fabric that allowed the bursts of artistic and engineering brilliance to happen. The monument, therefore, was not just an achievement of construction, but of community, a society in miniature where every role, seen and unseen, was a thread in the final, magnificent tapestry. For every stone set by a mason, a dozen other hands had already touched it. The cathedral rising in the city center was merely the final destination in a sprawling, continent-wide supply chain. This was the hidden economy of the monument, a vast network of paid, specialized labor that stretched from deep forest pits to distant mountain quarries, all humming with activity to feed the single, voracious appetite of the building site. To see only the construction is to miss the greater story, the economic revolution happening in the background. The true scale of a project like Notre Dame becomes clear when you follow a single block of limestone back to its origin. It began in a quarry miles outside Paris, a landscape of raw extraction. Here, quarrymen, skilled in reading the grain of the rock, would use wedges and hammers to fracture enormous slabs from the earth. These were not serfs, but wage-earning specialists who sold their dangerous expertise. They were paid by the volume of stone they produced, their work governed by contracts with the cathedral's building committee. Once freed, the multi-ton block needed to move. In the winter, when muddy roads were frozen solid, carters with teams of oxen would haul it overland on sledges. But the real highway was the river. The block would be loaded onto a flat-bottomed barge, operated by a guild of watermen who navigated the shifting currents of the Seine. They charged a fee per trip, their livelihood dependent on the constant flow of material. This river traffic was so vital that kings often granted special protections to these barges, ensuring the sacred project was not delayed. Upon reaching the city docks, another set of specialists took over. The block was transferred to a heavy cart, pulled through narrow streets by a carter who knew every turn and incline, his daily wage dependent on safe delivery. At the building yard, it was met by the rough masons, who would shape it into a basic block before the master cutters performed their finer work. But the stone is just one thread. Consider the iron. Every tool on site, from the mason's chisel to the carpenter's adze, required constant sharpening and replacement. This demand fed iron mines, forges, and smithies across the region. The blacksmith in his workshop near the site was a constant presence, his furnace lit day and night, repairing tools and forging the thousands of nails, cramps, and tie rods that held the stone and timber together. His raw material, iron ore, was sourced from miners and refined by bloomery workers, each link in that chain a separate, paid profession. Then there was the fuel. The blacksmith's forge, the lime kilns for making mortar, and the glass furnaces all consumed mountains of charcoal. This created an entire industry in the surrounding forests. Charcoal burners, living in temporary huts for weeks at a time, would carefully stack and smolder wood into pure carbon. They sold their product to middlemen who transported it to the city, a smoky, essential commodity that literally fueled the fires of creation. Even the humble scaffolding and the massive timber roofs required their own supply lines. Woodmen selected specific trees in royal forests, fellers cut them, and raftsmen floated the logs down river to saw-pits, where sawyers worked in pairs to plank the timber, their rhythmic sawing a song of industry long before the wood ever reached the carpenter's square. This was not a command economy directed by a single will. It was a decentralized, market-driven ecosystem. The cathedral's building fund did not own the quarries or the forests. Instead, it issued contracts and made purchases. It created demand, and 1,000 independent suppliers rose to meet it, investing in equipment, hiring their own laborers, and competing for business. A quarry owner near Chartres might lower his prices to win a contract over a quarry near Rouen. A barge operator with a faster crew could charge a premium for reliable service. This competition drove innovation in transport and extraction. The monumental project, therefore, acted as a powerful economic engine. It pulled wealth from the patrons' coffers and distributed it across a wide landscape, creating jobs and stimulating trade in a dozen allied industries. It turned pious donations into a blacksmith's new anvil, a bargeman's repaired vessel, and a charcoal burner's wages. The spiritual ambition at the city's heart generated a very tangible, very material prosperity in the countryside around it. The monument was not just built by society, it actively built society, weaving a web of economic interdependence that would last long after the final stone was laid. These supply chains and wages were not secret, they were meticulously recorded. The most powerful evidence against the slave narrative is not found in the stone itself, but on parchment. Across Europe, in dusty cathedral archives and royal libraries, survive thousands of pages of medieval accounting records. These are not heroic chronicles, but the dry, detailed work of clerks, and they offer us an unvarnished, line-by-line window into the true economy of a monument. These documents, known as building accounts or fabric rolls, were kept by the institution funding the project, like a cathedral chapter or a royal exchequer. Their purpose was practical, to track every penny spent and ensure funds were not misused. For us, they are a revelation, a payroll that lists the names, the jobs, and the earnings of the people who built the world we admire. Let us look at a real example. The accounts for the construction of Westminster Abbey's Lady Chapel in the 13th century survive. In neat, cramped Latin, a clerk records a payment to Master Henry de Raines, the king's mason, of 2 shillings per week for his expertise. This was a substantial salary, akin to a senior professional's wage today. On the same page, we find entries for William the carpenter, paid by the day for framing timber, and for dozens of laborers simply listed as John or Thomas or William, each receiving a few pence per day for digging foundations or hauling materials. These are not anonymous slaves, they are individuals with names whose time and skill had a clear, agreed-upon market value. The records go beyond wages. They itemize purchases that map the entire supply chain we just explored. One entry might note a payment to Robert Le Quarrier for 20 loads of stone from his quarry, delivered to the riverbank. Another records a contract with Agnes La Brewhouse for supplying ale to the workers for a month. Yet another details the cost of iron from a smith named Richard for making nails and tools. These are transactions, not commands. They show a world of negotiation and contract, where skilled providers competed for business and were compensated for their goods and labor. The level of detail is astonishing. Some accounts even note extra payments called bonuses for particularly dangerous work, like working at great heights on the scaffolding. They record payments in kind, such as providing a master craftsman with a robe for a feast day or a pair of shoes, benefits that were part of his compensation package. They show the seasonal ebb and flow of the workforce, with more laborers hired in the summer months when the weather allowed for longer days of mortar work and fewer in the winter. This paper trail dismantles the monolithic myth completely. It proves that the primary relationship between the monument and most of its builders was financial. The project was a massive, multi-generational employer. It attracted skilled talent with competitive salaries and attracted unskilled labor with the promise of daily wages that could support a family. The records show mobility, with masons and carpenters moving from one great project to another as their contracts ended, their reputations following them. They show specialization with distinct pay scales for a master carver, a rough layer, and a simple digger. This was a labor market, however primitive by our standards, driven by supply, demand, and skill. The very existence of these accounts is proof of a sophisticated administrative system, one that valued accountability and saw the workforce not as a disposable resource, but as a series of individual obligations that required regular and careful payment. When we hold these parchments, we are holding the receipts for a cathedral, the signed invoices for a castle. They are the mundane, bureaucratic truth that shouts down the romanticized fiction of endless, nameless toil. They force us to replace the crack of a whip with the scratch of a clerk's pen and the clink of coins in a palm. If the financial records are so clear, why did the simpler, darker story of slave labor ever take such a powerful hold on our imagination? The image of the overseer's whip is a powerful fiction. It is a symbol we have imported from much later periods of history and projected backwards, simplifying the messy reality of medieval worksite management into a stark scene of punishment. The truth of motivation on a cathedral or castle site was far more nuanced, a subtle blend of discipline, incentive, and shared identity. While authority was certainly present, it was less likely to be a man with a lash and more likely to be a guild warden with a set of calipers or the master mason with his detailed drawings. Primary tools of control were not violence but regulation, peer pressure, and the powerful lure of reward. The guild system provided its own internal discipline. A carpenter who used green wood in a critical roof beam, or a mason who cut a stone improperly, was not just failing his employer, he was shaming his entire craft. His offense would be judged by his peers in the guild, and the penalties could be fines, suspension from work, or even expulsion from the brotherhood that gave him his livelihood and social standing. This was a powerful form of social coercion, far more effective than random beatings in maintaining quality across a decades-long project. Alongside this was the straightforward incentive of money. The piece rate system, where a stonecutter was paid for each finished block, directly linked his effort to his earnings. A skilled, fast worker could earn significantly more than a slower one. This created a natural meritocracy where talent and diligence were financially rewarded. For the day laborer, the simple fact of a daily wage, paid reliably each week, was motivation enough to show up and work steadily. In an uncertain world, a long-term project represented security, a reason to stay in a growing town and build a life. Then there was the intangible but profound force of religious and civic fervor. Working on a great cathedral was not just a job, it was a participation in a sacred drama. The laborer mixing mortar or the carver shaping a saint's face could believe their work was literally building a house for God, a direct contribution to their community's spiritual life and their own salvation. This transformed routine toil into an act of devotion. Similarly, working on a grand town hall or bridge was a source of civic pride, a way to contribute to the fame and fortune of one's own city, to be part of something that would define the community for centuries. This collective identity was a powerful motivator. The social prestige of being associated with a great project cannot be overstated. A master mason's name would be known across regions. A skilled glazier could see his work illuminated by sunlight every day, a permanent advertisement of his skill. Even the humble laborer could point to the rising spire and tell his children he helped build that. This sense of legacy, of leaving a permanent mark on the world, is a deeply human motivation that transcends time. Coercion did exist, but it was often woven into the fabric of society itself. The peasant arriving to fulfill his corvée duty was compelled by the weight of tradition and law, not by an immediate threat of violence. His motivation might be negative, avoiding a fine or the Lord's displeasure, but his presence was part of a customary, predictable system. The economic coercion of needing a wage to feed a family was, and remains, a powerful driver. The key is that these forms of pressure were systemic and diffuse, not personified in a single brutal overseer. The worksite was a microcosm of medieval society with its hierarchies, its rules, its rewards, and its shared beliefs. Motivation was a spectrum, ranging from the spiritual joy of the volunteer to the economic necessity of the wage laborer, from the proud ambition of the master craftsman to the resigned duty of the peasant. To reduce this complex human ecosystem to the crack of a whip is to ignore the rich tapestry of reasons why people build together. It dismisses their agency, their skill, and their varied hopes. The monument stands not as a testament to fear, but as evidence of what a society can achieve when multiple strands of human motivation, from obligation to inspiration, are woven into a single, towering purpose. The starkest contrast to the medieval worksite lies centuries earlier in the shadow of the Roman Colosseum. To understand what made the cathedral builders' world unique, we must briefly look at the system it evolved away from. Imperial Rome perfected a model of monumental labor built on a foundation of conquest. Vast projects like aqueducts, roads, and amphitheaters were frequently constructed by enslaved populations on an almost industrial scale. These individuals, captured in war or born into bondage, were considered legal property. They could be organized into large, uniform gangs, housed in brutal barracks called ergastula, and driven by the threat of direct physical punishment. Their labor was an extracted resource like timber or marble, taken by the state and expended without compensation. The Colosseum itself was built largely by Jewish captives taken after the siege of Jerusalem, their work a monumental symbol of their own subjugation. This was labor defined by pure, centralized coercion, where the worker's identity, will, and benefit were entirely irrelevant to the finished product. The shift to the high medieval model represents a profound historical evolution in how societies organize human effort. By the 12th and 13th centuries, the large-scale, chattel slave gangs of antiquity had largely disappeared from Western Europe. The labor that built Chartres or Westminster was not a confiscated resource but a complex market. It was diversified, drawing from multiple social strata with different legal statuses. It was heavily monetized, with cash wages fueling both skilled guilds and casual day labor, and it was influenced by non-economic forces like religious devotion and civic pride that simply had no equivalent in the Roman system. The Roman builder was a tool, the medieval mason was a stakeholder. This evolution was not about morality, but about changing social and economic structures. The Roman Empire was a centralized state with a massive military machine that supplied a constant stream of captive labor. Medieval Europe was a fragmented landscape of competing powers, cities, and institutions. No king or bishop had access to an endless supply of captives, nor could they easily compel skilled artisans from distant regions without attractive terms. The guild system created powerful corporate bodies that negotiated for their members, turning skilled labor into a prized commodity that had to be bid for, not commanded. The rise of a money economy allowed obligations to be converted into wages, creating flexibility. This comparison sharpens the picture beautifully. It shows that the medieval monument was not the product of a stronger central authority, but often of a weaker one, relying on negotiation, contract, and shared interest rather than pure imperial decree. The legacy of Rome was the idea of the monument itself, the ambition to build eternally in stone. But the means to achieve that ambition had been utterly transformed, woven into the very fabric of a society that was learning to build not just with forced hands, but with paid skill, devotional hearts, and a web of mutual economic benefit. This shift from extraction to engagement is what gives the medieval cathedral its deeply human character, a quality felt in every hand-carved leaf and every sunlit pane of glass. This intricate web of obligation and wages was not a universal blueprint. The model we have been exploring, with its powerful guilds and monetized labor, was strongest in the heartlands of northwestern Europe, in the bustling cities of northern France, England, and the Holy Roman Empire. But travel 1,000 miles south to the sun-baked shores of the Mediterranean, and you find a different world with different rules, where older systems of labor persisted longer and left their own mark on the stones. The geography of a monument often reveals the geography of its society. In the dynamic, commercially driven north, the rise of towns and trade guilds created a robust market for skilled, free labor. A master mason in Cologne or Paris was a businessman, negotiating contracts and moving where his talent was valued. The dense network of cities meant competition for the best craftsmen, driving innovation and solidifying their economic power. This environment fostered the collaborative, long-term projects we associate with the great Gothic cathedrals, where financial and devotional investment merged. But cross the Alps into the Mediterranean world, and the political and social landscape shifts. Here, the legacy of the Roman Empire and the constant interplay between Christian, Muslim, and Byzantine cultures created a more fragmented and often more militarized setting. In places like Norman Sicily in the 11th and 12th centuries, rulers maintained a complex, multi-ethnic kingdom where various forms of unfree labor, including slavery, remained a more visible part of the economic and social fabric for a longer period. The Norman kings, adept administrators, drew on traditions from across the Mediterranean, which could include the use of captive or compulsory labor for certain state-driven projects, particularly military fortifications or royal palaces designed to display power over a conquered populace. This does not mean every stone in Palermo was laid by an enslaved person, far from it. Skilled Greek mosaicists and Arab architects were highly prized and well compensated. But the available labor pool included individuals with less freedom, which could influence how large-scale, unskilled tasks were organized. The contrast highlights a crucial point: complexity itself varied by region. In the north, the complexity was in the contracts, the guild regulations, and the fluid market for skill. In some southern contexts, the complexity lay in the overlapping legal statuses of workers within a more hierarchical and often coercive state system. A castle built on a contested frontier in Wales or the Holy Land might share similarities with one in Sicily, both prioritizing speed and security, and thus more readily employing levied or compelled labor for earthworks. Meanwhile, a cathedral in Amiens and a cathedral in Milan, though both expressions of faith, might have been funded and staffed through subtly different civic and religious structures. This regional variation warns us against a single, sweeping narrative. There was no one medieval labor system. There were many, adapting to local power structures, economic development, and cultural traditions. The monument is therefore a historical snapshot. It freezes in stone the particular blend of freedom and obligation, market and command, that existed in that specific place at that specific time. To understand the hands that built it, we must listen not for one story, but for the many whispers of the region from which it grew. The intricate balance of medieval labor was shattered by a single, invisible force. In the middle of the 14th century, a wave of illness swept across Europe with a speed and severity the world had never seen. This period, remembered as the Black Death, was a human tragedy on a scale that is difficult to comprehend, claiming the lives of an estimated 1/3 to 1/2 of the entire population in just a few terrible years. The immediate social and psychological impacts were profound, but in the long arc of history, this catastrophe also became a watershed moment for the very people who built the monuments. It tore apart the old fabric of society and, in the emptiness that followed, rewrote the fundamental rules of labor. The sudden, drastic scarcity of people changed everything. For centuries, lords and institutions had relied on a large, readily available pool of workers, whether they were serfs bound by obligation or the urban poor desperate for any wage. After 1348, that pool evaporated. Whole villages were left empty, workshops stood silent, and building sites were abandoned as masters and laborers alike succumbed. In the eerie quiet that followed the worst of the crisis, a new economic reality dawned, one where human labor was suddenly a precious and scarce commodity. The laws of supply and demand, suppressed for generations by feudal structures, now asserted themselves with undeniable force. For the first time, the worker held a powerful new card, the simple, devastating fact of their rarity. The result was a dramatic and sustained rise in wages for almost every kind of work. This was true for the master mason, whose specialized skill became even more valuable as patrons competed to restart their stalled projects. But it was revolutionary for the common laborer. The man who once hauled stones for a few pence a day, easily replaced, now found he could demand double or triple that amount. A peasant who had fulfilled his corvée duty under the weight of tradition could now look at his lord's depleted fields and realize his own labor was worth more elsewhere. He could flee his manor, head to a town where workers were in desperate demand, and command a cash wage that offered a freedom his ancestors could never have imagined. This massive shift in bargaining power made older systems of pure coercion not just cruel, but increasingly impractical and economically foolish. A lord trying to build a new gatehouse for his castle could no longer simply summon his half-empty villages to provide forced labor. He needed to attract workers, and to do that he had to offer competitive terms. The compulsory corvée began to crumble, often commuted into cash payments that the lord would then use to hire willing hands. The great projects that resumed in the late 14th century, like the magnificent perpendicular Gothic additions to English cathedrals or the flamboyant town halls of Flanders, were built in this new world. Their account books tell the story. The wages recorded are significantly higher. The contracts for masons and carpenters are more detailed, specifying not just pay but also benefits, reflecting a need to secure loyalty in a competitive market. The relationship between patron and builder became even more explicitly transactional, a negotiation between a buyer and a seller of skill in a market tilted toward the seller. This did not erase hardship or inequality overnight, but it did accelerate the centuries-long transition toward a society where labor was increasingly mobile, contractual, and monetized. The monument after the plague was less a product of feudal duty and more a product of a contract. It was built by survivors who, amidst the profound loss, had gained a new measure of power over the value of their own hands. The world of obligation was fading, and the age of the wage was rising from the ashes. That newfound power of the worker echoed in the quiet of the stone yard. The soaring ambition of the high Gothic cathedral, that century-long prayer in stone, began to meet a new and stubborn constraint: the simple, rising cost of a pair of skilled hands. While faith remained undiminished, the economic engine that had turned that faith into vaulted space was undergoing a fundamental shift. The immense, labor-intensive projects that defined an era became, in many places, financially and logistically daunting in a new way. This did not end great building, but it subtly redirected its expression, weaving changing labor economics directly into the fabric of architectural style. The Gothic cathedral was a marvel of complexity, demanding an almost industrial level of coordinated craftsmanship. Its defining features, the ribbed vaults, the flying buttresses, the forests of sculpted figures, and the vast expanses of stained glass, each represented thousands upon thousands of hours of highly specialized labor. A master carver might spend months on a single intricate capital. A team of glaziers could take a year to complete one majestic window. Before the great population changes of the 14th century, the system could absorb these costs through long-term institutional wealth and a large, relatively inexpensive pool of supporting labor. Afterwards, that calculus changed. The same master carver, now one of fewer surviving craftsmen, could command a higher wage. The team of glaziers, their skills in even greater demand, required a more substantial contract. The economic model of building in the grand, slow, cumulative manner became exponentially more expensive. Patrons, whether bishops, kings, or city councils, now faced budgets strained not just by ambition, but by the new reality of a seller's market for skill. One visible response was a shift in scale and focus. Instead of launching another complete cathedral from the ground up, patrons often turned to completing or embellishing existing structures. The magnificent perpendicular style that flourished in England after the 14th century is a perfect example of this adjusted ambition. It was frequently applied as a glorious envelope to an older building, like a stunning new skin. Projects focused on refashioning a choir, adding a breathtaking tower, or installing immense windows that were more about elegant, repeating geometric patterns in stone tracery, which could be efficiently templated and replicated by masons, rather than the endless unique figures of earlier eras. This was still breathtaking work, but it was in many ways more efficient, maximizing visual impact for the skilled labor invested. The architectural imagination also began to explore different avenues. There was a growing fascination with the centralized, symmetrical plans of the Renaissance, inspired by a rediscovery of classical antiquity. While driven by intellectual currents, this style also offered a different kind of logistical elegance. The clarity of a dome or a symmetrical cross plan could, in theory, be executed with a different, perhaps more manageable, organization of labor compared to the sprawling, additive nature of a Gothic basilica that seemed to grow organically for generations. The patron's role evolved as well. The era of the single, lifelong master mason giving his entire career to one site began to wane. Projects were increasingly broken into discrete contracts, a new chapel here, a gatehouse there, each tendered to a master or a workshop for a fixed price and duration. This reflected a more modern, managerial approach to controlling costs in an unpredictable labor market. The monument was becoming less a lifelong communal endeavor and more a series of negotiated artistic commissions. This is not to say that economic pressure alone changed architectural style. That would be far too simple. Intellectual movements, religious reformations, and new materials all played profound roles. But the changing world of work provided a powerful undercurrent. When the cost and difficulty of securing and coordinating vast armies of diverse labor increased, the architectural dreams of society adapted. They became, in many cases, more concentrated, more strategically planned, and more sensitive to the value of each hour of skilled craft. The stones themselves began to tell a new story, one not just of reaching for heaven, but of carefully balancing the books on earth. What then is the ultimate legacy of those forgotten hands, if not the monuments they left behind? The persistent crack of the whip in our minds is a sound from a much later century. Why does the slave narrative cling so stubbornly to these stones, even when the historical record whispers a different, more complex story? The answer lies not in the medieval period itself, but in the way later generations chose to remember it. Our modern vision of the age was largely forged in the fires of the Romantic era of the late 18th and 19th centuries, reacting against the rationalism and industrial grime of their own time. Romantic poets, painters, and novelists crafted a powerful new myth of the Middle Ages. They saw it as a world of stark contrasts and raw emotion, a time of chivalrous knights, pious monks, and, crucially, absolute monarchs commanding limitless hordes of obedient subjects. In this romanticized view, the cathedral or castle became a symbol of overwhelming, singular will. the messy realities of guild negotiations, wage disputes, and contractual obligations were airbrushed away. In their place, artists like the painter John Martin created breathtaking, apocalyptic canvases showing tiny, faceless figures toiling under the shadow of colossal architecture, evoking a sense of sublime terror and anonymous power. This artistic vision was incredibly seductive. It replaced the complicated ledger books with a simpler, more dramatic story, one where history moved through the commands of great men and the suffering of invisible masses. The Victorian era then cemented this idea, often using the imagined medieval past to comment on their own industrial present. The faceless builder became a parallel for the factory worker, and the all-powerful king or bishop stood in for the modern industrialist. This framing made the past feel familiar and served as a cautionary tale about unchecked authority, but it did so by flattening the medieval world into a caricature. This romantic fallacy was then inherited and reshaped by modern political narratives. In the 20th and 21st centuries, the desire to find clear moral lessons in history has often led us to simplify complex systems into binary tales. We look for stories of pure oppression versus pure genius, of victimizers and victims, because these are powerful, emotionally resonant frameworks. The slave narrative fits perfectly into this mold. It provides a direct, morally clear link between the grandeur we see and a system we condemn, allowing us to neatly categorize the past and assign blame. It turns the monument into a simple relic of tyranny, making history feel settled and understood. The problem is that this clarity comes at the cost of truth. By reducing the medieval workforce to a single, oppressed class, we unintentionally repeat the Romantic era of making them faceless. We erase the agency of the master mason who bargained for his salary, the pride of the carver who signed his stone, the economic choice of the day laborer who migrated for work, and the devotion of the volunteer who sang hymns while passing stones. We replace their diverse human motivations with a single story of coercion. In doing so, we not only misunderstand how these societies actually functioned, but we also rob those individuals of their historical presence. We turn them back into the anonymous ciphers the Romantics imagined, denying them the dignity of their varied lives and their complex roles within their own world. The monument becomes a screen onto which we project our own modern anxieties about power and labor, rather than a window into a foreign and fascinating time. The true story is less about absolute power and more about negotiated power, less about silent suffering and more about the myriad ways people found meaning, status, and livelihood in a collective endeavor. To hear that story, we must learn to listen past the romantic echo of the whip and hear instead the tapping of the chisel, the murmur of the market, and the chorus of a community at work. That persistent echo of the whip does point to a real and painful truth within the stone. To complete this picture, we must return to the difficult reality that systems of unfreedom were woven into the fabric of the age. Slavery and serfdom were not myths, they were legal and social facts for millions. The error lies not in acknowledging their existence, but in assuming they were the universal, all-purpose engine for every kind of work. Their role was more specific, more geographically varied, and often relegated to the most punishing and least skilled layers of the monumental endeavor. Chattel slavery, the treatment of a human being as property, had diminished but not vanished in Western Europe after the year 1000. In the Mediterranean world, sustained by different economic and political currents, it persisted longer. Where it existed, it was typically directed toward tasks that were brutally difficult, dangerous, and required minimal training. The back-breaking work of extracting stone from a quarry, for instance, or mining metals deep underground, often fell to those with the least freedom. The conditions in these places were harsh, the risks of injury or illness were high, and the work was seen as a form of raw resource extraction, not unlike mining the stone itself. This was labor at its most coercive, where individuals had little to no stake in the final, glorious product their suffering helped supply. Serfdom, more widespread, also supplied brute force rather than refined skill. A serf's annual labor obligation was most logically used for what his lord needed locally: heavy, repetitive tasks that benefited the manor's immediate infrastructure. When applied to a grand project, this often meant the initial, grueling phase of work, digging the vast foundation trenches for a cathedral, a job of pure muscle and mud. Hauling the quarried stone from the riverside to the building yard, a relentless procession of weight, or producing the millions of roof tiles in nearby kilns. These were essential, foundational jobs, but they were one step removed from the act of creation. The serf moved the canvas and prepared the pigments, but he was rarely the hand that painted the masterpiece. The crucial distinction lies in the application of skill. The act of designing a vault, carving a saint's serene face, leading a stained glass window, or engineering a timber roof, these were realms of knowledge. They required years of voluntary, dedicated training, a personal investment that simply could not be compelled at the point of a sword. A master would not waste his secret geometrical formulas on an unwilling apprentice, and a guild would not admit a conscript. The intricate work that defines these monuments, the very soul of their beauty, almost invariably came from the hands of individuals who had chosen their craft, who took pride in its mastery, and who were compensated, often handsomely, for their expertise. Their relationship to the stone was one of dialogue, not domination. This means the labor system was a deliberate hierarchy of task and status. At the bottom, often associated with the least free, was the world of raw material and raw power, the extraction and transport that fed the site. Above that was the world of paid, unskilled muscle, the diggers and haulers working for a wage. And above them, in both social standing and compensation, was the world of the artisans, the guildsmen and masters whose skilled hands did the creative and technical work that turned material into meaning. Unfreedom was a part of the foundation, but it was not the architect, the sculptor, or the glazier. To see the entire cathedral as a product of slavery is to confuse the quarry with the spire, to mistake the origin of the clay for the artistry of the potter. The monument stands as a testament to a society that knew how to use many different kinds of human effort, but reserved its highest achievements for the hands it had to attract, respect, and pay. So let us step back and see the cathedral whole, not as a single building, but as a beating economic heart. It was a social and financial project of staggering scale, a multi-generational engine that transformed piety into prosperity and community into stone. To see it as an act of tyranny is to see only the shadow it cast, missing the vibrant, bustling town that lived in its light. The true model is one of a dynamic hub, a central point where countless strands of medieval life were woven together into something enduring. At its core, the project created a sustained demand that rippled outward for miles. The need for stone employed quarrymen and bargemen. The need for timber employed woodcutters and carpenters. The need for iron employed miners and blacksmiths. The need for food employed farmers, bakers, and brewsters. This was not a trickle-down economy. It was a river of cash flowing from the patrons' coffers, circulating through the hands of specialists and laborers, stimulating markets and encouraging innovation in transport and craft. For a century or more, the cathedral site was the region's largest and most reliable employer, a gravitational center that pulled people and goods toward it. This economic engine also required a layered, sophisticated workforce, a temporary society stratified by skill and status. At the pinnacle were the master masons and architects, the creative directors whose knowledge was so valuable they lived like nobility. Beneath them were the guild craftsmen, the carvers, glaziers, and joiners, whose proud professional brotherhoods guaranteed quality and negotiated strong wages. Supporting them were the armies of manual laborers, some fulfilling traditional obligations, others drawn by the promise of daily cash, their collective muscle lifting the artist's work skyward. And woven throughout were the volunteers, the devout whose donated effort turned labor into liturgy. This was not a monolithic pyramid of oppression, but a complex social organism with different roles, different motivations, and different rewards, all necessary for the whole to function. Financially, the project was a mosaic of funding. It drew on the deep institutional wealth of the church, the taxes and pride of growing cities, the personal vanity of wealthy merchants, and the micro-donations of the faithful. Each funding source created a different kind of accountability and a different relationship with the builders. A bishop might demand theological precision, while a city guild might insist on showcasing their patron saint. This constant negotiation between money, meaning, and material is what gave each structure its unique character. Ultimately, the cathedral was the ultimate expression of communal identity. It was not imposed from above upon a passive populace. It was, in a very real sense, built by the community for the community. The merchant funded a window to ensure his family was remembered in prayer. The baker donated days of labor to atone for his shortcomings. The guildsman carved his mark into a hidden stone, signing his contribution to eternity. The finished building was a physical ledger of that society's hopes, fears, wealth, and skill. It was where economics met devotion, where obligation met ambition, and where the anonymous toil of the quarry met the celebrated genius of the master's plan. To reduce this profound, collaborative achievement to a simple story of slave labor is to silence the chorus of voices that sang it into being. It is to mistake a symphony for a single, crushing note. The silent stones of a cathedral hold a quiet rebuttal to a grand historical myth. For centuries, we have labeled the millennium between Rome and the Renaissance as the Dark Ages, a long, stagnant night of ignorance and brutality where society was frozen under the boot of kings and the gloom of superstition. This powerful narrative tells us that progress halted, that economies crumbled, and that people lived without agency, mere pawns on a feudal chessboard. But if that were true, how did they build this? The very existence of these monuments, born from the complex labor systems we have explored, forces us to rewrite that simplistic story. They are not relics of a dark time, but dazzling proof of a light we have refused to see, evidence of a society humming with sophisticated organization, vibrant corporate life, and a profound capacity for collective action. To call the Middle Ages dark while standing in the kaleidoscope of light from a Gothic window is a contradiction we can no longer ignore. The intricate dance of guilds, wages, contracts, and devotional labor reveals a world that was not simple but brilliantly complex. It was a world that invented the university, pioneered double-entry bookkeeping, and established the legal concept of the corporation through town charters and guild ordinances. The cathedral building account, with its meticulous lists of names and payments, is a document of breathtaking administrative clarity. It shows a society that could plan for a century, manage budgets across generations, and coordinate the work of thousands of individuals from dozens of professions. This is not the hallmark of a dark age. It is the signature of a highly organized, economically inventive civilization. The guild system alone shatters the myth of a monolithic, top-down society. These were not just trade unions, they were the medieval equivalent of professional associations, licensing boards, and social welfare networks. They created a powerful middle class of artisans who answered not to a feudal lord, but to the standards of their craft and the laws of the market. Their ability to move from city to city, selling their skill to the highest bidder, demonstrates a level of personal mobility and economic freedom that the Dark Ages stereotype completely denies. The vibrant, self-governing towns that grew up around cathedral sites further complicate the picture. These communes fought for and won charters of liberty, governing themselves through elected councils and creating a civic identity separate from the rural feudal order. The grand town hall, often built with the same pride and skill as the cathedral, stands as a monument to this secular collective power. Here, agency was not a rare gift from a king. It was negotiated, purchased, and earned through collective effort. This forces us to confront a deeper question about historical agency. The old story gives all the power to kings, bishops, and nobles, casting everyone else as passive recipients of their will or victims of their oppression. But the labor behind the monument tells a different tale. It reveals a spectrum of agency. The master mason exercised immense creative and managerial agency. The guildsman exercised economic and professional agency. The wage laborer exercised the agency of choice, moving to where his work was valued. Even the peasant fulfilling a corvée duty operated within a web of customary rights and negotiations that gave him a sliver of leverage. To see only oppression is to miss the myriad ways, large and small, that individuals and groups navigated, shaped, and sometimes resisted the structures of their world. They were not simply living in history, they were making it with their hands, their contracts, and their communal vows. The term Dark Ages, then, tells us more about the eras that coined it than the era it describes. The Renaissance humanists, looking back, saw their own classical ideal missing and declared a millennium a wasteland. The Enlightenment thinkers, championing reason, dismissed the age of faith as one of childish fantasy. We inherited this prejudice and it colored everything, but the stones ask us to look again. They ask us to see not a dark age, but a different kind of light. A light not of rediscovered classical purity, but of ingenious synthesis. A light not of unchecked individual genius, but of profound communal achievement. A light built not by slaves under a lash, but by a society that had learned how to marshal faith, finance, skill, and muscle into a shared vision that could touch the sky. When we truly see the hands that built the world, we must also see the sophisticated, striving, brilliantly organized world that built those hands. The next time you stand before a medieval cathedral or castle, you are not just looking at a building. You are holding an open book, a layered archive written not in ink, but in stone, timber, and glass. To read it, you must learn to see the signatures of the society that built it, the subtle clues that reveal the complex world of collaboration we have been exploring. Start by looking for the variety in the craftsmanship itself. Run your gaze along a long stretch of wall. You will likely see rows of nearly identical windows, their tracery repeating a precise geometric pattern. This is the mark of efficiency, of a system at work. These elements were likely mass-produced, in a sense, by teams of masons working from wooden templates, a practical solution for covering vast areas with beauty while managing time and cost. It speaks to organized workshops and a division of labor. Now, look closer. Find a capital atop a column or a boss where the vault ribs meet. Here, amidst the repetition, you might discover a burst of unique life. A stone carver has chiseled a sly fox, a grumpy face, a detailed scene from a fable, or a perfect cluster of oak leaves so realistic you can almost hear them rustle. This is not a template. This is the personal flourish of a skilled artisan, a moment where a guildsman's individual artistry and humor were given space to breathe. The monument holds both the efficient system and the creative individual within its walls. Then, look for the evidence of different phases and hands over time. A cathedral is rarely a single, coherent thought. You might see a rounded Romanesque arch from the 12th century awkwardly meeting a pointed Gothic window from the 13th. A wall might change color or texture halfway up, showing where construction halted for a generation after a famine or a war, only to resume with stone from a different quarry. These seams and shifts are not flaws, they are historical punctuation marks. They tell of changing masters of the works, of new patrons with new tastes, of economic booms and busts that sped up or slowed down the work. Each change in style is a new chapter, a new contract, a new set of hands picking up the tools left by their predecessors. See the building not as a frozen moment, but as a centuries-long conversation between generations of builders. Finally, shift your perspective entirely. Do not see it as a single dictator's tomb, a monument to one person's ego. See it instead as a collective ledger of human effort. The soaring height testifies to the engineer's bold calculations. The forest of sculpted saints speaks to the theological vision of bishops and the patient skill of carvers. The radiant windows glow with the wealth of merchant donors and the technical mastery of glaziers. The very existence of the foundation speaks to the anonymous, aching backs that dug the trenches and hauled the rubble. Every element, from the grandest spire to the most hidden roof tile, represents a different kind of contribution, a different social agreement, a different human motivation. When you learn to read this document, the building comes alive with voices. The quiet tap of the mason's chisel becomes a statement of professional pride. The ledger entry of a wage paid becomes a contract of respect. The worn step of 1,000 pilgrims becomes the echo of a community's faith. The monument ceases to be a silent relic of a dark and simple past. It transforms into a vibrant, multi-generational meeting place where the free artisan, the obligated peasant, the devout volunteer, and the ambitious patron all left their mark. It becomes the ultimate proof that history is not made by great men alone, but by the intricate, often unseen, collaboration of an entire society reaching together for something timeless. What other stories are waiting in the stones around us if we only learn how to listen? The true story of these stones is a mosaic, not a monolith. The medieval monument was not the product of a single dark force, but of a brilliant and intricate fusion of human effort. It was built on a foundation where wages paid to free artisans met the customary obligations of the unfree, where the proud regulations of guilds governed the work of master carvers, and where the silent devotion of volunteers gave spiritual meaning to the most mundane tasks. This was not a simple hierarchy of command, but a complex ecosystem of economics and social ambition, where faith, finance, skill, and muscle were woven together across generations. To cling to the slave narrative is to choose a simpler, poorer history. It flattens a vibrant tapestry into a single, grim thread, erasing the agency of the mason who bargained for his salary, the identity of the carver who signed his stone, and the community that saw the rising spire as its own collective prayer. By moving beyond that powerful myth, we gain something far more valuable, a richer, more accurate, and profoundly more human understanding of the past. We see a society capable of breathtaking organization and collaboration, one that could turn a shared dream into enduring reality through a web of contracts, customs, and beliefs. So the next time you stand before an ancient structure, let your eye wander beyond its grandeur. Look closely at the seams in the stone, the variety in the carvings, the play of light through glass. See it not as a monument to one will, but as a living archive of many hands. Ask the quiet questions: whose geometry planned this vault, whose wages bought that timber, whose devotion carried this stone? In asking, you begin to hear the forgotten chorus of history, the symphony of countless lives that built the world, one deliberate, purposeful stone at a time.